Taylor Johnson, thank you so much for joining me today. So happy to have you. Thank you for taking the time to join us on the Music Mindset podcast. I'm very excited for our conversation. So you and I have connected online, and in our conversations, I found it so intriguing, just all the overlap between our different fields, what we do. We're both in the business consulting space, but then your background, how you got there from sports to these professional areas and many other very interesting professional areas. I thought was very intriguing. So I look forward to chatting with you today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Okay, great. So I'm always fascinated by that theory called the Medici effect. I think you and I chatted about it when we first spoke. And it's that book and theory of, that argues that the greatest ideas and the greatest breakthroughs really come when we bring different concepts together, bring different experts together from different fields into new, unfamiliar territory. Really helps to shake up that confirmation bias, the ways that we might look at things that we're so accustomed to looking through our own lens when we're able to bring another expert from another area. So I love this opportunity to explore just all the intersection of the things that we do and all the different fields that we'll talk about. So what I loved about your background is really that winding path that you've taken to get where you are. So currently, you coach executives, CEOs, industry leaders, but then you began your career working with top performing athletes. And of course, in the NFL,
Yes.
which is very, very interesting with the San Francisco 49ers. And then you've also coached, gamers in between, right? So I would love to kick off if you would just be open to walking us through that path that you've taken so far in your professional career and kind of what all those pivot points have been that took you from the NFL to working with gamers to CEOs, software development, all of these really interesting things that are on your biography.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for that. I'd say to your point earlier about the Medici effect, what I'm able to do now, and the circles that I'm in, and the conversations that I'm having, the clients I get to work with, none of that would have been possible had I not had some amazing mentors and learned from just great people along the way.
Yes.
So I'm incredibly grateful for those opportunities. And like you said, my path is, I guess if you zoom out and you look at the time horizon, it may look linear, but if you zoom in, there were so many zigs and zags. It was
I
all
bet.
over the place.
I bet.
And I became very accustomed to that. That just became the status quo and what I anticipated and what I looked for,
Hmm.
which was an interesting thing for me. So my background's in athletic performance, coached in college and the NFL for about years. And what was interesting about that track for me is I'd always said that my passion was performance,
Mm.
and it's my curiosity that navigates me through the world. And so it was my curiosity which really led me to all the amazing opportunities that either were presented to me or that I ended up creating for myself. And
Mm.
so it was so much more than just the physical training for me, which
Hmm.
was my bread and butter, right? Strength conditioning, kinesiology was like the main kind of staples of what I started. And then I got really interested in sports psychology and nutrition and sports science and the integration of all these different factors. And
Hmm.
so getting to the NFL it was a journey for sure. And when
Hmm.
I finally got there, I was like, this can't be the end all be all. It was amazing for
Yeah,
sure. And I
of
loved the
course.
work that I did. And then I was like, okay, there's got to be something else beyond this because human potential is so much more than just what we're doing on the field. It's so much more than just the programming stuff we're doing on the back end. I was
Mhm.
very curious to say, this is the physical domain. We do this quite well. What else is possible in the cognitive domain?
Hmm.
So that's what really kind of like piqued the curiosity and started to get me down this track of, well, what's like same, but different,
Hmm.
where there's this athletic component and there's this difference in let's use our brains, not so much our bodies, although that is a factor for sure. And so
Hmm.
that's what really kind of took me from traditional sports into gaming and esports.
Interesting. So I love what you've touched on with the adaptability, because I know in my own teaching, I try to really speak up on people think that practice is all about that repetition and locking things in with
Mm,
this sort of rigidity, but actually it's about being able to refine your ability to adapt and to not
yes.
get locked in. And it's that tricky kind of double-edged sword because we're constantly telling people, well, you have to put in the repetitions and you have to focus and go deep, but at the same time, somehow stay wide open to completely pivot and adapt
Yes.
when the opportunities arise or when the needs arise. So that's so fascinating that natural curiosity brought you there. So was there a clear pivot to move from the NFL to something like gaming, or was it something that you were invited to do, called to do, or was it yours saying, "Hey, I'm interested. I'm going to go call those gamers and see if I can help them out."
Yeah, it's probably yes. It was like a combination of
Okay.
all those things that presented, which is like so cool, right? Like
Hmm.
that's just kind of like the joke of life is like if you just show up and play all out, things will present themselves to you. And just
100%.
one point on your adaptability point, it's like for sure, you when you put in intentional practice and you're putting in a lot of time to developing your craft, there
Hmm.
can be a sense of rigidity of like, hey, this is the discipline and like constantly chipping away at that stone.
Hmm.
And to use a pretty overplayed cliche, it's like you want to see the forest through the trees. If you're
Hmm.
always focused on like what you're chipping away at, you can't actually see the bigger picture.
Hmm.
And a mentor of mine very early on used to always tell me, he's like, yes, you stand on the shoulders of giants, but always check to see where they're looking and
Mm.
do the opposite. Like look the
Mm.
other way, scan the
Yeah,
horizon. And that always kind of stuck with me. And so
it's great advice.
to the, it was, I
Hmm.
got that at an early age. I was very
Hmm.
fortunate.
Great.
And so being in the NFL, like the kind of the recipe for how that pivot happened was I was with the San Francisco 49ers. We're in the Super Bowl now. Super stoked for them.
Great.
When
Yeah.
I coached there, we weren't the best team,
Okay.
right?
Well,
So it's kind of like it's
compounds over time. You contributed. Yes.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, no, here's the thing though. Like, I think there's tremendous value of being a part of an organization or a team at the low of lows because
Agree.
you really learn about human nature. It is
Hmm.
very easy to get people motivated to do things that you want them to do when you're winning. You're just
Hmm.
steamrolling. When you're losing and having a losing season, specifically in sport, there's always kind of like what's going to happen next. And
Hmm.
so the tools and skills I've developed in that time is like how do you get people to do what they really need to do that they don't want to do?
Hmm.
And how do you play the game of building rapport and building trust when just things aren't going the way you want them to go? So I
Hmm.
developed a lot of really unique skills. So being in that time frame, those 2 years, we made it through one coaching change. I did not think we were going to make it through another. I had
Yeah.
enough wherewithal and understanding of like how that game is played,
Hmm.
and so started looking for some other options. I had opportunities to go to some other NFL teams. And then I kind of paused for a moment and thought, it's like, well, what else is out there? I'm
Hmm.
entrepreneurial minded. People in my family are very successful entrepreneurs. I'm like, if I were ever to try something different, now would be the time because the
Hmm.
NFL will always be there. And so again, fortunate to have a lot of amazing mentors and colleagues and dear friends in different spaces. I think that's been
Hmm.
a theme in my life is the diversity, the range of people in my life allow me to really assimilate and grab different information and synthesize it, which is such a gift.
Such a
So
gift.
I reached out to like a ton of people. I was like, hey, you know me, you know what I'm about, you know what I'm into. What am I not thinking of that's out
Hmm.
there that could be something really cool?
Interesting.
And so one of my dear friends, Rami, he was a former CEO of a tech company called Push, which later got acquired by Whoop.
Great.
He goes, man, you should check out esports. I was like, huh. Like I'd thought of it, but I didn't really grasp how big it had gotten. So I
Hmm.
started to look into that space and ask the questions I would of any other sport team. Like I didn't care that they were gamers. Like I saw them as high performers. And
Hmm.
what I realized very quickly is there's a lot more similarities and differences.
Yes.
Obviously, the biggest difference is they're not using their bodies in this physical output, but their cognitive output through the roof.
Yes.
And it takes a physical body to be able to channel and hold that energy to focus that cognitive energy.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, there is something there. And what I realized is not a lot of people were thinking of them in this way of like these
Hmm.
high performers. And so I started to reach out. It helps having the NFL on your resume. When you start reaching out to people,
For
they're like,
sure.
oh, cool, let me
Yeah.
respond. So it's all about leverage,
Yeah.
and understanding your skill set and your abilities and your background and leverage.
Hmm.
And so I started to ask questions, and that led to more conversations and more opportunities. And ultimately, we did end up leaving. Our staff got let go from the NFL,
Hmm.
and rather than going to another team, I was like, okay, I'm going to give it a year and just go all in and try to do this esports thing. And
Right.
by the end of that year, I got picked up by an organization, which actually was a holdings company, and we owned 5 professional organizations, 14 professional teams,
Hmm.
and a developmental academy. So I became the VP of performance.
Wow. What a pivot. What an
Yeah,
incredible
it was
pivot.
it
What
was
a
a big
gr-
one for sure.
what a big one. So a couple things that stand out in such a huge way. First of all, from the very start of that, where you come at it from an active growth space of, I'm going to ask the people around me who I trust, what am I not seeing? And that in
Yep,
itself is something that I think all of us can do more of and learn more from, right? It's to say, hey, where are my blind spots? Because truly we can't see them if we don't have those trusted mentors around
for
us.
sure.
The other part of that is, of course, that you embrace the similarities and the differences. But how challenging did you find it for you to communicate those similarities to those people in esports? Because obviously you come from the NFL and they say,
Mm,
okay, you've got that leverage, you've got that credibility, but kind of what are you calling me for, right? Like we kind of see that overlap where you would then be able
yeah.
to frame to them, hey, just so you know, you're doing a lot of these same things, whether or not you realize. Was that challenging, or were they pretty
Mm.
receptive, or is it a skill that you've honed?
It was probably a skill that I honed over time
Hmm.
because my background is not in gaming. And so I did
Hmm.
not claim to know their space. So it's kind of like you want to go in there with the beginner's mind.
Yeah.
And I made those mistakes early on of just making assumptions of like, oh, it's got to be like this.
Hmm.
And because it looks so similar. And then, you just learn trial and error, right? I just realized that's
Yeah.
just not the case, just as like many other things in life.
Hmm.
So I really started to double down on that beginner's mindset, just like, hey, what is it really like for you? I have
Hmm.
an idea based on what I'm observing, but what's it really like?
Hmm.
And one of the angle I ended up taking with these individuals, both at the organization level and the players themselves, is it's all about the framing. So I framed it as your brain is your moneymaker. Do you
Hmm.
agree? And they're like, well, yeah,
Hmm.
like I make my money because it's my mind. It's not my body, it's my mind.
Hmm.
I'm like, great. Well, what if I told you that reaching your full potential was just the beginning and you could leverage different tools to amplify your moneymaker, which is your brain? They're like, okay, that's kind of interesting.
Hmm.
So what I was trying to do is like going fishing. I was just like, okay,
Yes.
what's the angle? What's the language that lands with them? And it's the person with the most flexibility in your language will be the one that can actually control the conversation
Hmm.
and drive insights. And so
Yes.
the ability to chunk up, chunk down, lateral chunk, what I mean by that is if I'm talking to an individual and they're just not getting what I'm saying, then I change what I'm saying or I change the
Hmm.
direction. So I'll chunk up, I'll think bigger picture. I'm like, hey,
Yeah.
let me chunk up and say, hey, are you a big picture person? Kind of paint the picture.
Yeah.
And if that's not working, then you can kind of chunk down. Or a lateral chunk is coming up with analogies and metaphors. And
Hmm.
so I learned that the flexibility in communication is a very powerful tool. And I use that a lot with my coaching now.
Hmm.
And so by constantly just checking and trying different things, I found like this brain moneymaker thing, they get it. They latch onto
Hmm.
that. And then I think the other thing, again, what played in my favor was coming from the NFL. Like, oh, kind of like the confirmation bias. Like he's been in the NFL pilot, he must know something.
For sure.
Like,
Yeah.
great. That's at least like a
Yeah.
step in.
Yeah.
And then it was a lot of co-creation. It was a lot
Hmm.
of really getting curious about what's going on for them, what are their pain points, and
Hmm.
how can we help them very quickly address some of the low-hanging fruit. And then bigger
Hmm.
picture, like, yes, I'm going to help you improve the way that you play the game, not from the technical tactical, because you'll know more than that than I ever will.
Hmm.
Let me try to help reinforce the lifestyle, the nutrition, mindset, recovery component.
Yes.
Like, oh, well, and oh, yeah, by the way, I'm going to teach you how to eat, move, and be healthy.
Yes.
And that was kind of like the camouflage, the Trojan horse of like, I'll make you a better cognitive performer. But actually, what I'm doing is teaching you how to like have better life skills.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. I have to say, I mean, when you're sharing just such high level communication to be able to adapt, again, that adaptability and be flexible and respond to that feedback that you're getting. And I know from a musician standpoint, I always believe one of the strongest elements of a gifted teacher is being able to respond to the needs of the person they're teaching, right? Because you might say the exact same thing, same 10 things to all of your students constantly, but you've got thousands of different ways that they need to hear it and they need to receive it,
Yes,
right? And if you're not able to adapt to that, then you're just going to be, hitting that wall every time.
totally.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
And then I feel like that is such a smooth transition then. I mean, I'm sure it involved another great big pivot, but how that transitioned into you coaching, CEOs and thought leaders, just with that brain power, being able to
Yeah.
support that and all of the cognitive challenges that business leaders have. Is that right?
Totally. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I'll share one kind of stop along the way to that pivot because it's relevant. So
Hmm.
working with the esport organizations and the professional players, I ended up working for a startup where we were blending neuroscience technology with gaming tech. So we
Hmm.
were just building this amazing platform for helping individuals train their speed, precision, accuracy, and reaction time through video games. And we were collecting all this data on the back end, and it's
Interesting.
basically a cognitive assessment and training tool. And
Hmm.
so working in that startup, we were a fast startup. I mean, they're still around today. They're doing great. They're called AIM
Hmm.
Labs. I was like
Okay.
number 10 employee. I left when we had
Right.
150. So it was like being
Wow.
strapped to the front of a rocket ship with duct
I
tape
bet.
and bubble gum,
I bet.
right? And so like,
Good
and
picture.
I know you appreciate that, right?
Yeah.
So what I ended up learning through that process was being a part of a startup and
Hmm.
taking those coaching tools and the skills that I had and just applying them in a different context.
Hmm.
And so that's when I started to really work with different executives and start to understand the through line in all of it was understanding who you are as a person and how you're showing up so you can be better at what you do. And I
Hmm.
think a lot of times people skip to like, I'm just going to do these things better, do
Yeah.
more of these things, but they miss out on, well, who am I first? Like, what are my
Hmm.
values? What are my goals? How do I perform under pressure? What are the things that flip me on, turn me down?
Yeah.
And when you kind of build out this more robust operating system, we'll call it this user manual,
Hmm. Hmm.
life, those are like your cheat codes. So I used to tell my players that in esports, like the more you know about yourself, these are cheat codes. And so the
Absolutely.
same thing applies for these
Mm.
executives and founders. It's like
Yeah.
the more you develop this sense of awareness, that's like rocket fuel because
Hmm.
you develop more filters for what's a yes and what's a no,
Hmm.
or you develop more tools and resources for how you want to show up in that board meeting.
Hmm.
And it's the sense of awareness. And so that's really a lot of the work that I do now is it's not so much on the physical side, although that is a component. I'd say it's more holistically where we look at the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, just
Hmm.
all of it together and really anchoring to individuals' core values in a specific area of life, primarily its
Hmm.
career.
Yeah.
And then what are the associated behaviors for those values?
Hmm.
Because I subscribe to the notion that values drive beliefs and beliefs drive behaviors.
Yes.
So if you're not taking action or taking a behavior that's in line with your values, either those aren't really your values, or
Hmm.
there's something going on with like a negative emotion or limiting belief, or you're shooting yourself in the foot that the behaviors don't match.
Hmm.
That's a lot of where my work is now.
Hmm. Oh, and that's just the richest work to be in, truly.
Oh, I love
Because
it.
the, I
Yeah,
mean,
I love it.
everything, any type of output, whether it's music, athletics, gaming, like it all stems
Yeah.
from that, truly. And I love, again, with that theme of adaptability is that it's about finding your user manual. It's not about
Yes.
you giving these specific, drills. I know in music, that's one thing that always gets under my skin. And people say, do these 10 different drills. And it's like, well, if that's what you need, or what are you even
Yeah.
experiencing when you do those drills and how are they going to impact and what
Mm,
are you responding to, right? And so it's like it can't be this one size fits all. And
yes.
finding your unique user manual that is rooted in your principles, your beliefs, that's a massive, that will change your total trajectory without a
It'll
doubt.
change your whole life. It'll change
Hmm.
your whole life. I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, you touched on it. It's like some of the most fulfilling and fun work. You know,
Hmm.
like I see it as it's all play, right?
It's all
Because we're all just trying to
curiosity.
figure out it's
Hmm.
curiosity and play. Like
Hmm.
that's my whole sign off. Stay curious.
Beautiful.
Because I think that is the essence of, how you really make life more fun and interesting.
And growth, right? You have to
Exactly.
stay curious if you want to keep growing. There's always a blind
Well,
spot.
the thing
Hmm.
about that too, I heard this the other day, is like there's this contradiction where we want to learn and grow, but at the same time, we want to know exactly what we're doing. And
Hmm.
you can't hold two at the same time. It contradicts itself. So you
Very
have to
true.
kind of let go of the fact that you'll never really know what you're doing if you want
Hmm.
to continue to learn and grow.
Very
And so
true.
it's getting over that fear, whatever it's holding you back in that space, and just surrendering to what is. And it's not to say you're not playing an active part in surrender. It's saying, hey,
Hmm.
I'm going to only control what I can control and continue to open myself up to opportunities.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful mindset and very clear how that would apply in all scenarios. Okay, so so amazing. What a inspiring journey where you are, and no doubt that it'll just continue to grow and evolve in who knows how, right? Because you're going to be
Mm-hmm.
approaching it with that spirit of curiosity. My
Yep.
experience, obviously owning one of my businesses is our brick and mortar school, where we work with so many youth. I tend to come with always a level of curiosity about people's early years because I
Mm.
get to see firsthand kind of how early formative experiences really have this ripple effect through adulthood, through the way that you want to impact the world throughout the rest of your life. So I'm just curious, with all of this focus around, high performance, do you have an earliest memory or any pivotal moment that comes to mind that you remember around performance, whether that being something, we have heartbreaking experiences where you kind of had to get
Mm.
back up again, or something that you were just so charged up and you said, I love this, I want to learn more about this. Do you have like an early memory that comes to mind around performance?
Let's see. It's interesting. What comes up first for me is
Mhm.
where I think I got my curiosity from, which I think will
Mhm.
then lead into performance. So my grandfather on my dad's side was engineer for NASA, and he worked on some really cool projects. And I remember very early in my childhood going over to their house in Palo Alto, California, and going and playing in his garage. And it
Mhm.
was like the ultimate candy shop of tools and like engines being ripped apart and
Yeah.
electronics and woodworking and like all this crazy stuff. I just remember
Hmm.
spending hours
I
and
bet.
he did not care what I did. He just let me run loose,
Wow.
tear things apart, try to put it back together, which never worked. Like,
Hmm.
you know, I take something apart, try to put it, it would just never work again the same way, which I
Hmm.
think is kind of cool because that creates something different.
Yeah.
So that's where I think a lot of the curiosity came from. And for me, the performance, you know, I think one of the earlier memories for me was really around in high school
Hmm.
where I kind of realized I was athletic, like
Hmm.
athletic enough to be good at football. I wasn't excellent, but I was good enough.
Hmm.
And that curiosity again, I was playing, you know, American football and realizing like, well, we're not really getting a lot of physical training. Like I want to improve in X, Y, and Z in the sport. So let me just go figure it out myself. So I ended up like reading books and trying to
Hmm.
understand training. And I think that's like kind of the shift. And I was like, I'm actually kind of good at this.
Yes.
And then being able to share that with my teammates, and they're like, "You're actually kind of good at this." And I was like, "Oh,
Hmm.
maybe there's something there." And so that's really, I think, what started to take me down that track.
Hmm. Very interesting. It's almost like you wanted to see what made the outcome, what put it all together, and you pulled apart the pieces, just like you did with all the
Yeah.
NASA
And you
gear
know,
in the
it's
garage,
funny.
right? Yeah.
It's so funny because so much of the coaching that I do now is really looking for patterns.
Yes.
And I talked earlier about like the chunking up, down, and lateral
Hmm.
chunking. You know, when an individual is sharing a specific story about there's something that's challenging that they're trying to work through, a lot of what we're doing is problem solving. And I can't solve that problem for them. What I can do is ask questions to help them unpack whatever that problem is,
Yeah.
not necessarily why it's there, but how are they doing this problem? They have an
Hmm.
active part in that. So part of that is being able to elicit the story of whatever it is,
Hmm.
chunk down and say, okay, well, what is the pattern that's happening in the
Hmm.
story? Then chunk up and say, okay, now that we understand this pattern, where else is this pattern showing up?
Beautiful.
Lateral chunk to that, chunk down, expand. So we kind of extract all these different pieces and then say, okay, is this actually the real problem? And
Yes.
they're like, oh my God, yeah. And it's
Yes.
all over the place. I'm like, okay, well,
Yeah.
let's fix it.
Beautiful. Ah, that's brilliant teaching. That really across the board. I'm sure that would apply in all your sports as well. It certainly
Yeah.
applies in how we teach music, right? So,
Yep.
beautiful. So aligned with what you've shared there. So with this podcast, for example, I named it
Mm.
Mindset for that exact
I
reason.
love
It's
that.
like, well, it's not
Yeah.
specifically about music. It's about how this mindset and the way that you train and the things that you learn about yourself, how it transfers throughout everything that you do, the way you train, the way you practice, the way you approach challenges, right? So with that, I know just mindset is such a general term when you think about like the NFL players, the leaders, the gamers and the startup founders, all these people who are really leaning towards this high performance, was there a really key similarity in their personality or mindset that comes to mind of like how would you
Mm.
describe these people? Like would you say they're type A? Are they very creative? Are they like in your
Mm.
experience, is there that common thread in their personality and kind of mindset essentially?
Sure. Yeah, I would say there's different levels to it, right? Just like
Hmm.
anything else.
Yeah.
Some of the best performers are the ones that have a deep sense of self-awareness.
Mm.
And I think that is the one commonality across the board. And they may not be able to articulate it, if that makes sense. Like they just
Mhm.
know within themselves, like, yes, this works really well for me. And I'm not quite sure why, and that's okay. But
Mhm.
like this is why I do it this way because it works really well for me. So
Mhm.
they have this general sense of awareness, whether it's the kinesthetic awareness, moving their body in space, or just the cognitive awareness, or just it being able to draw on their senses
Mm.
to create this richness in their environment. That definitely stands out for me.
Okay.
Um, and I think the other part of it too is this kind of goes in line with the awareness is they're reflective. Like they
Mm.
actually look at
Interesting.
how their performance went, whether it was positive or negative, there's always lessons. So
Mhm.
one is having the awareness, two is the intentionality to say, okay, with this awareness, what can I actually learn from that?
Mhm.
And I think that's a very interesting piece where if you don't apply action to your awareness, then essentially it's only half the equation.
Mm.
Like you can, and I was actually having a conversation with my mentor about this of meditation by itself is kind of just like a hack,
Mm.
meaning you're just increasing your awareness, but you're not actually taking action on what's coming up or what's becoming available to you.
Hmm.
And I still haven't quite wrapped my mind around all that yet. I just think it's an interesting
Hmm.
thing to throw out there. And a lot of times when I work through stuff, I kind of just workshop it real time. So you just got a taste of
Yeah.
that. So,
Yeah, no, and it's beautiful. I mean, it reminds me of things like educational philosophies, like constructivism, where it's like you need to experience
mm,
it first, and then you become an active participant in the growth when you later reflect on it. It's one thing to
mhm,
hear it, but it's very different to experience it and then do that reflective learning
totally.
back towards the experience. And what I think is interesting is because I think when I say those things, professional NFL players, world-class gamers, startup tech founders, right? The things that come to mind are things like type A, ambitious, drive, work all night, like those kinds of things that come up, which I
Yeah.
know that there's always an element of. But when you're saying
Yes.
kind of the key factor that, makes these people excellent is actually their ability to stop and reflect, is kind of what I heard
Well,
you say there. I know it's a balance, but
yes. Yeah.
yes,
I
what would
think
you
that's
say?
just it because I
Mm.
think there's a distinction between a high achiever and a high performer.
Mm.
So a
Mm.
high
Interesting.
performer is one that can increase their performance and
Hmm.
extend out. So basically, they have the longevity.
Hmm.
And so to be a high performer is you can consistently perform at a high level time and time
Mm.
again. And with that, you have to have recovery and reflection and understand what's working and what's not. A high
Mm.
achiever, in my opinion, is almost like a flash in the pan. Like you can grind
Yes.
and get some success, but if you can't sustain that success, is that really success? I mean, it depends on
Yes.
how you define it.
Yeah.
So what I found with the awareness and the reflection is like some of the super vets, we call them super vets in the NFL, like the guys who've been around for like 10 plus years,
Hmm.
they know how to regulate themselves in practice. They
Hmm.
understand what food works best for them. They understand how to best process film when they're
Hmm.
debriefing their own practice or games or when they're preparing for the next game. Same thing in gaming and esports. Same
Hmm.
thing in these CEOs and executives who understand that they're playing like 5D chess. And
Yes.
in order to play high level chess, you have to have pauses and reflection and understand strategy. Then
Hmm.
it's a combination of working in the business and working on the business. So there's always this interplay. And one thing I'll state from my own perspective is I actually don't believe in balance. I don't
Hmm.
think it's possible to hold anything in equal parts.
Okay.
What I do believe in is harmony,
Hmm.
where and the way I define that is you have the thing that you're focusing on in this season of life and you orient the rest of your life and variables around that and it
Absolutely.
just works. It kind of flows with that.
Hmm.
But what that does is it's a forcing function to up level your communication with other aspects in your life. Because if you just focus on one thing and that's the only thing you focus on, we're going to drop these other balls. So the idea is to
Absolutely.
create harmony in whatever season of life that you're in.
Hmm.
And I think when you do that, it takes the pressure off. I need to balance everything,
Hmm.
which, gosh, it's so hard.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible.
Yeah. You know what? That's such a beautiful distinction. So first of all, I'll say the difference between the high achiever versus high performer. I love that. That's going to stick with me for sure. So, thank you for that distinction. And then it's
Mm,
interesting when you say balance versus harmony, because those terms have very similar and synergistic meanings in music, right? So when I think
mm,
balance in music, for example, I don't actually think symmetry that they have equal parts, right? It's about finding that balance of what's at the forefront, what's supporting, what we
ah,
hear, what projects, right? And so
sure.
what you said, I think I'll agree with and support. It's like finding that harmony. So balance is actually finding where it all kind of fits together, where the whole orchestra can play, and
Yeah.
some are, supporting, some are projecting through. I think that's beautiful, and I
Cool.
love hearing that come through. No, um, when you think about, because you mentioned earlier, it's more challenging to coach a team that is on a losing streak than a winning streak, which I believe. When it comes from a standpoint, like I've worked with organizations and within organizations, what do you find is the change that has to take place when you're coaching these teams to kind of maintain that drive, that collective drive towards a common goal when you are not doing so great or having a losing season?
Yeah. Um, I'll speak for me in my experience and actually what was modeled to me from my mentors in that space. What it really takes is consistency. Is
Mm,
showing up and being the same person every day,
mm,
regardless of the wins and losses.
mm.
Because
Right.
I think what that does is it models what's possible despite external circumstances. Like I
Hmm.
am So I was never the guy on the sideline who would be like super rah and fire. I was always just even kill.
Hmm.
Now, don't get me wrong. Like if we score, we had a great play. Like of course I'd be fired up,
Hmm.
but it was tempered to match the energy and actually counterbalance the energy of what was happening around me.
Hmm.
And that's just what was modeled to me by my mentor. And I really that resonated because he actually had said to me, he goes, you need to be the complement to what else is happening. So if there's
Hmm.
super high energy, you need to be able to hold the line and
Hmm.
contain the energy. If it's super low, you need to be able to kind of bring them up, but you're not getting so high, right? You're trying to bring them along because they will go
Hmm.
as you go.
Yeah.
And so actually that's really what stuck out to
Hmm.
me from that mentor specifically is they will go as you go.
Hmm.
So if you are consistent, regardless of the highs and lows, they will go as you go. So they will follow. They'll
Hmm.
continue to chip away and just continue to show up because that's what you need them to do.
Hmm. And it comes back to that same trusting of the process, right? Like whatever the outcome may
Yes.
be at this time, it doesn't change
Yes.
that you continue to reflect back, continue to grow, continue to look for those blind spots, even when you're doing well, right? When sometimes when we
Yeah,
do well, it's like,
totally.
oh, we're done, we've landed, but then that's when you start resting on your laurels and you start to fall back
Yes.
on those things, right? And there's always more that can be done and more to learn, for sure.
Yeah. Well, one more thing on that point too,
Hmm.
if I can,
Hmm.
is there's always lessons in winning and losing. Like
Hmm.
even with winning, there are ways to win really well. There's ways to win pretty poorly.
Hmm.
And it's important. Sometimes winning can mask a lot of dysfunction that
Hmm.
what's underneath the hood.
Yeah.
So if you don't come at both from an objective standpoint to say, okay, what's really the gold and the lesson here? You
Hmm.
could be missing out on a lot. And the same is true for the flip side. Like if you're losing, there's pros and cons in the losing. So it's just
Hmm.
an important thing, which I would imagine is true across, all performing, whether it's music and sports, because again, it's all information and feedback.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, a question on that with just having coached many different team players and seeing that team dynamic as well. If
Yeah.
you had to vote, I mean, this comes from probably more of a business hiring standpoint. If you had
Mhm.
to bring on someone, if you had the opportunity to coach someone with high skill, but then maybe high ego, maybe not the best mindset, versus
Mhm.
low skill and low ego that you can kind of coach a little, that's a little bit more coachable.
Mhm.
Who would you rather work with? Or do you see
So
pros
I've
and cons
got
of
I've got
working
some
with each?
follow-up questions for you for more context, if I
Okay,
can.
yeah.
Do both people have the aptitude to improve? So I guess it's more specifically the person with low skill, do they have a high aptitude to increase their skills? Because some
Yeah,
people are capped.
it's true. So it comes from a place and the belief that people can be coached, but it
Yes,
depends on their mindset of if they're
for
coachable,
sure.
right? So
Yeah,
if they're
totally.
receptive to that coaching. So
Yeah.
yeah, mhm.
Yeah. So I think so. And then my other question would be like, where are we in the business cycle? And I guess like that doesn't matter so much as to say, I would choose the person with the lower skill and the better mindset
Okay.
because you can teach skills
You can
for
teach. Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Um, but what's harder to teach or unteach is somebody's ego and get them to be a team player and develop a sense of trust. And
Hmm.
I think a lot of that comes from if you look at, the military and special operations and the selection process,
Hmm.
far often they're not really looking for the person with the greatest skill set. They're looking for the person that could develop the most trust and
Hmm.
the teamwork and the ability to maintain composure under stress because they
Hmm.
can teach skills all day.
Yeah.
And it's the qualities of the individual that matter and how well can
Hmm.
you mesh with your team. And I think that's what's most important. So it's
Hmm.
selecting for that because you can teach anybody skills.
Because you can teach anybody that. Thank you for that. That's great. Um, so in an earlier discussion that we had, I found it really interesting that you mentioned in your coaching that you use terms like and concepts of tempo, rhythm, harmony, you've already
Yeah.
mentioned on this call,
Yeah.
orchestration, that those are central themes. And I know when I started tennis lessons, for example, I was so kind of pleased that it talked a lot about beats and rhythms and the sound of
Yeah.
hitting the ball with a certain type of swing, all those things. So tell me more about that. Just how do musical elements tie into just how you orchestrate these outcomes for the people that you work
Yeah.
with? If it's a matter of the terms you use or the analogies that you give them, is it something that
Yeah.
permeates more than I might realize? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So I think it started when back when I was coaching in college and I was writing our programs for all of the American football team. All right.
Mhm.
So it was like our varsity team and I was writing programs. And again, influence from my mentor, who was very much into classical music,
Mm,
and he was very much into having like identifying like the rhythm and
mm,
tempo and cadence,
mm,
because there is a rhythm and tempo to the game. Like the game of
mm,
football can actually be broken down into series, sets, and reps. If you look
mm,
at the amount of activity, the amount of rest, the amount of series, and how that compounds over the 60-minute game, it's
mm.
series, sets, and reps. And
Interesting.
so that became part of how I would reverse engineer a lot of our programming. So it was all position specific. So we have our bigs, which is the O line and D line, our mid skill linebackers, tight ends, and then our skill players were like our wide receivers and DBs and such.
Mhm,
And each one of those players, like each one of those positions, had different rhythm, tempo, and so it was trying to understand like how can we
mm,
put them in a position to be successful in the competition itself by reverse engineering or coming up with derivatives of like exposure to those same rhythm, tempo,
mm.
and such. And so that's
Interesting.
kind of how I would fold into their conditioning and their training program, and even
Yes.
the cadence of our workouts themselves,
Hmm.
of really thinking like, okay, if this was a song, what is like my intro? What's like the
Mm.
crescendo? And then how do I lead them
Oh,
out of it? Like, how do I want them
excellent.
to leave? How do I want them to feel? And
Yes.
that's very much how I approach my coaching sessions now. Now, granted, it's very less scripted because a
Hmm.
lot of times you got to meet the people where they're at and what's in
Yeah.
the room. And overall, there's a rhythm to it.
Hmm.
And there's a cadence to our calls,
Interesting.
and
Yes.
there's a rhythm to how we're communicating, and there's also
Yeah.
rhythm in my tonality and how I'm talking to somebody. If they're
Hmm.
really freaking out, if they're going through something hard, it's like I match and then I drop them down,
Yes.
right? It's like I meet them where they're
Yeah.
at and I bring them down, or I might bring
Yeah.
them up, or I bring them left or right. It doesn't matter. And
Great.
so there's very much that musical element in it.
Excellent.
And yeah, and then also I listen to a lot of music every day. And
Hmm.
when I was writing programs for my athletes in different phases of training, I would listen to different types of music because I'm like, this is the feeling that I want them to have when we're training.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
then now when I write programs or I think about bigger kind of strategy sessions, I have different types of music that kind of get me in that zone.
Oh, so of course I have to ask what music for what zone, because different music can obviously
Oh,
can change your heart rate, your cortisol. You don't have to do
totally.
specifics, but like, do you have a certain style where you'll listen to something during your programs
Yeah.
versus getting geared up for coaching sessions? Or I'm of course
Yeah,
curious
totally.
to
So
know.
for me, I love EDM, like different genres
Hmm.
of EDM,
Yeah,
because what I find is like again, it's this integration of all these different types of flavors and textures
interesting.
of music. So it's
Hmm.
all over the place with EDM.
Yeah.
I also love classical music. I love classical guitar, and I
Mm.
love like flamenco guitar. So it really
Yes.
depends on what I'm feeling, and also like how I'm feeling in that day.
Hmm.
Like
Good.
it's also to meet me where I'm at and be like, you know what, I'm a little bit low on energy. I got to get juiced up to write this
Match that
program. So let
energy.
me give me something.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Um, I read in one of your posts, so I connected with you on LinkedIn for our listeners and readers. I really enjoy your posts on LinkedIn, so you can follow Taylor on LinkedIn to connect with these posts as well. But a recent one said that stood out to me that you don't like the term peak performance, that
Yes.
try to avoid that. So that was really, going even preparing for our call today, I was thinking, okay, peak performance, peak performance. And I said, oh, this is again a very interesting reframe, which I think is very valuable. And I think it would be really worthwhile for our listeners, especially, I think in all fields, but especially when there's sort of a sequence to how you're training in your early years and you get to a point and you kind of go like, have I peaked? Am I at peak performance?
Yeah.
Am I there yet? Kind of that idea. So I'm curious
Yes.
if you'd share your thoughts on that.
Yes. Yeah. I I think we should strive, and I'd be careful with the word like should. First off, I think
Hmm.
nobody should do anything. It's either you
Excellent.
could or you couldn't. You choose or you
Hmm.
don't, right? And that's totally
Hmm.
fine. And I would encourage people to aim for optimal over peak. And the
Hmm.
reason being is because I see different individuals that are really like peak performance all day, like strive for
Hmm.
peak performance. But what happens is like when you hit your peak, you're at the apex, you have to come back down. And
Exactly.
so the question becomes like, what are you peaking for?
Hmm.
And I think when you are chasing peak performance on a daily basis, actually what you're doing is you're not giving yourself the time and space to rest and recover. And you're
Hmm.
never really going to push your potential or push the envelope, your capacity to increase your potential.
Hmm.
So I like to encourage people to aim for optimal. And what that means is identifying your upper and lower threshold.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you're going to push yourself to the edge and you're going to feel what that edge of capacity feels like. And you're also going to feel like the bottom end, like when you're just kind of doing nothing. And you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
find a sweet spot in between.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, you know, you're able to, one, you're developing a sense of awareness. Like, you know
Yeah.
what is too much, you know what that edge is, so that
Mm-hmm.
if you need to go to that edge, you can go there and you know what it's like to stand right on that, like toes hanging over it, but you're not jumping off.
Yes.
And then on the flip side, you understand like what is the minimum, I call them BAMs, like your bare ass minimum. Like,
Mm.
what is your BAMs level of activity to get things done that if
Mm.
you need to completely drop everything that you're doing and just hit the minimum, you know
Mm.
what that feels like too.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you play in this range, that gives you this operational output. And I think when people do that, what they end up finding is they're able to accomplish a lot more than they think because they're able to recover. They're
Mm-hmm.
able to actually
Mm.
maintain a higher level of output for a longer
Mm-hmm.
period of time, which is what I'm saying is what a high performer is.
Yes.
And then when you do that, then you can really compete when it matters most because you
Mm-hmm.
understand, but I'll use sport terms, you understand what your game day is,
Mm-hmm.
where every day is not your game day.
Mm-hmm.
And you're being strategic about when and where are you placing those maximum bouts of effort and how are you working backwards from that. And so
Mm-hmm.
this is what kind of pulling the line from sports is in physical sports, we're really good at working backwards from game day.
Mm-hmm.
So when I coached in the NFL, we planned all of our training sessions from either our Sunday or Monday game, and we worked
Mm-hmm.
backwards from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the same thing in gaming and esports, but not from a physical sense, from a cognitive sense. You say, okay, when
Mm-hmm.
are we playing our games? How do we make sure that we load ourselves and give ourselves enough space to recover such that on game day we can be at our very best?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in our desk-bound jobs or our business athletes is what I call them,
Mm-hmm.
we don't really do that very well. We don't
Yeah.
understand, and we think every day is game day. And so
Yes.
when you're chasing your peak performance every single day, inevitably you're going to burn yourself out.
Mm. Oh, so valuable. It actually is. Thank you for that. It's also
Mm-hmm.
in line with another question that I had, so I'll go straight to it because it's so related, is that, in performance, in music performance, we have our practice performances, and then of course, again, we're preparing for that live performance where you're on stage and everything kind of counts. How do you recommend that your players, for example, like some of the things that you shared, is it about having that cadence? Is there a set framework? I imagine you're going to say no, there's no one size fits all for everyone. Is it about finding your threshold and figuring out how you ramp up to those game days, those performance days, in the things that you do before? Because there is a tendency in music performance, for example, is right before performance, you start looping and performing too much and kind of
Mm-hmm.
racing through and
Yeah,
let me try it again, let me try it again. And it's like, no, that's actually going to have the opposite effect, right?
sure.
Do you have something that works for athletes that you can share with us that's kind
Yeah.
of framed? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and you're right. My answer would be like it depends because
Mm-hmm.
everybody's so different. And
For
so
sure.
the way I like to frame it, which pulls in some of the inspiration from sports and then blends that with product development. So like this
Mm-hmm.
Scrum or Agile system, where essentially you're working in sprints. And I made a post about this too, where it's more about being intentional with your effort and then
Mm-hmm.
having intentional recovery. So
Mm-hmm.
if you know that you have, let's say you have a music performance coming up, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, one is understand like, do you have a pre-performance routine
Yes.
on the front end?
Mm-hmm.
What is it like, a couple of days before? What is it like the day of? What is it like after? Like, how do you decompress and recover? What's your debrief look like? So you
Mm-hmm.
understand that piece of it.
Yep.
And then you say, okay, if I were to work backwards from that, how many weeks or how many months out am I from this performance?
Mm-hmm.
And then what are the cycles that I can run through? Maybe it's a 1 week or 2 week sprint where you're kind of building up your capacity, you're practicing different aspects of it, and you get a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of rest and recovery. And then you build, build,
Mm-hmm.
build, and then you recover. And then you build, 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 and then you recover.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times with the individuals that I work with, we're running these like sprint cycles. And I call them sprints because that's what we use in product development.
Mm-hmm.
And they understand like it's just bouts of effort,
Yes.
intentional bouts of effort followed by a bout of recovery.
Rest.
And the
Mm-hmm.
recovery, yeah, rest, recovery, and then also
Mm-hmm.
reflection. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think if you do that, and that's very similar in sport where we would run, anywhere between 2 to 6 week training cycles, depending on where
Mm-hmm.
we're at in the season.
Okay.
So load, 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 three
Mm-hmm.
weeks on, 1 week reload, 3 weeks
Mm-hmm.
on, 1 week reload. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you look at the time horizon, if you kind of zoom out, it's this trajectory of like upward growth and
Mm-hmm.
increasing your capacity. with
Hmm.
very intentional breaks to give yourself time to rest and recover. And the other
Hmm.
thing I'll say too, this kind of speaks to your point about the looping and overdoing it.
Yes.
This is taken from track and field, where a lot of times people are really there's four things. There's stimulate, adapt, stabilize, and actualize.
Hmm.
We're really good at stimulating and adapting.
Yes.
We're not very good at stabilizing and
I was
actualizing.
gonna say
And
four. What do
so,
you mean four? Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly,
Yeah.
right? So, and I think that's really important to know. And it's really
Mhm.
important to know about yourself,
Yes.
because the time that you'll spend in each one of those phases is really dependent upon who you are at this stage of your life and your
Hmm.
skills and your determination, the things that you want to accomplish. And
Hmm.
so stimulate, adapt for sure. And then you
Hmm.
got to be able to stabilize that new growth or that skill set and really test and tinker and kind of poke holes in what you got to then
Hmm.
actualize what that real performance is, and then get back into tank or the think tank and practice
Hmm.
and stimulate, adapt again, and then stabilize and actualize.
Hmm. Beautiful. So valuable. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Mhm.
Very, very valuable. Um, So this ties in. So at every stage of what we've talked about today, you talk about the importance of that recovery and that rest and reflection, which I love. And I think is so important, that reflective learning, but then that also reflection for awareness, for being strategic about what your next steps are. So from a physical standpoint, so I know from as musicians, we'll talk about how we're doing so much. It's very physically demanding, but with these kind of micro movements and micro muscles, whereas you might not be seeing the whole macro movements, but there's so much happening at such a fast pace. When you mentioned that
Yeah.
neuroscience program that the gamers use, I was thinking, oh, musicians would love that because there's so much that's happening, but just in these small, small fires. Um, I always advocate in the importance of sleep, nutrition, water, right? People will, get close to performance and then just kind of pull all-nighters because they want to practice, practice, practice. And it's like, well, you're
Mhm.
still your physical being. You have to care for your body. For performers who are, will spend an hour or more on stage performing something that's very demanding cognitively and physically, very complex for memory, that they have to pay attention, keep their focus, all of these things. What would you say the most important thing is, along with everything that you've shared, to keep specifically our bodies performing optimally? Like, do you think if is it a matter of make sure that you also do weight training, make sure that you get a certain amount of sleep? Are there certain foods? I know that's all very
Mhm.
broad, but just for our
Sure.
physical, our true instruments are our bodies for our output as
Yeah,
well, right? Mm-hmm.
totally. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I love that you bring this up. The first thing I would say is sleep.
Yes,
Life is
good.
way easier when you sleep.
I'm such a
It
sleep
like
person. Yeah.
it's so important, right?
Yes.
It's like your tactical decision making, your ability to articulate. It's
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes I've worked with individuals in the past, but they're like, for them, when they don't get sleep, and this is a lot of different factors that go into it, but it's like pushing your thoughts through jello,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Oh,
if you're a high performer and whether you're a pianist or you're a gamer or you're a CEO,
mm-hmm.
closing deals, you need to have clarity of thought. And so sleep
Mm-hmm.
is like, it's free. Okay.
Yeah.
Newsflash, it's free.
Yeah.
Um, the thing about that is it's a skill. Like sleeping is a skill.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not taught really how to sleep. And part of that again comes back to the awareness of understanding what sleep hygiene is and what does that look like for you.
Mm-hmm.
And are you the type of person who needs a little bit more or less time to get in that zone of sleep, or that
Mm-hmm.
like the space or the mindset of sleep? Like it is a
Mm-hmm.
mindset and it's a skill. So
Hmm.
sleep is the first one. I think the other one is, obviously with the food that we put in our bodies, definitely it's gonna impact our cognitive output and also just our physical body and our energy. So
Mm-hmm.
being very mindful of the food that we eat. And I don't subscribe to any one diet. I say whatever makes you feel the best, like go with
Mm-hmm.
that. And the caveat being, try to limit sugar and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you can get very granular with that with the cognitive athletes, specifically, the gamers. We were really interested in exploring different types of nutrition diets and supplementation for them.
Fats and all
But
those things.
yeah, totally. But
Mm-hmm.
the basics is just eat some good food,
Eat
eat some
real
good
food.
food, drink some water,
Yeah.
eat real food, drink some
Yeah.
water, stop at 80% full,
Yes.
and, be mindful about how you're spacing out your meals.
Mm-hmm.
Hydration's a big one too. And then you
Yes.
talked about the physical movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I can appreciate that there's probably a lot of similarities between the gamers and musicians.
I see
And it's a
that.
lot of posture, right? It'd
Mm-hmm.
be a lot of posture because
Mm-hmm.
pianists and then, different instruments. And so for that, the with the gamers, we didn't put them under a barbell and have them squat or do super heavy weight. It's like, what is the actual competition
Mm-hmm.
environment and positions that they need to be in, and how do we allow them to do that longer and without hurting? So
Hmm.
it's a lot of corrective exercise. And yes, you want to do some strength training just for general health and wellness for longevity purposes. But really,
Mm-hmm.
it's about understanding how do you unwind them in certain positions? Because
Mm-hmm.
let's say, a lot of gamers, their backs will start to hurt because they're
Mm-hmm.
sitting for long periods of time.
Yeah.
Well, if you're sitting for long periods of time, your hip flexors get super tight. When your hip
Hmm.
flexors get tight, it's this thing called reciprocal inhibition, where if your hips are tight, your glutes will turn off. Well,
Hmm.
your glutes are supposed to be the primary stabilizers of your back, your posterior chain. So
Okay.
if your glutes are off, then your hamstrings and your low back take over, and like that's why you have back pain. So those try to
Hmm.
stretch their back, but I'm like, dude, it's not your back, it's your
That's not,
hips.
yeah. Oh.
So it's trying to understand, like, hey, well, what are the positions I'm going to be in? How
Mm-hmm.
do I allow myself to do this more comfortably and for longer so that I can be
Mm-hmm.
the best at what I want to do?
Mm-hmm. Oh, brilliant, brilliant advice. Um, on that same note, we've got the physical aspect and our outputs are what we're relying on. But do you notice, like, if you're having that off day, like, for example, I love what you just said about sleep being a skill, because I value sleep so much. But then sometimes the night before performance, you kind of put all this pressure on yourself to have to
Yeah,
get a good night's sleep, and then you end up getting insomnia that night, right? And
totally.
what you
Yeah.
said there is like, well, I guess not if you've actually practiced sleep as a skill. If you're kind of
Yeah.
hoping for it to be like an output of chance, that's from how you do all your other skill building. No, it's a skill that you need to build. So that's a
Yeah.
huge light bulb that went on for me right there. So thank you. Do you have experience with yourself or with athletes or gamers that you train that really your mindset will be what impacts the physical outputs? Like you can do all the things right, but if you aren't in the right frame of mind, is there a way that you can ensure that you stay in that frame of mind so it doesn't have any negative impact to your physical
Yeah.
results? Yeah.
Yeah. The big thing that I've been spending more time practicing myself and
Hmm.
also working with clients on is equanimity.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is like the ability to remain cool, calm, collected, regardless of whatever's happening around you.
Hmm.
And it's this game between observation and entanglement.
Hmm.
And my mentor is the one who's been really working with me on this. He's very brilliant with psychology.
Hmm.
It's this game of between observation and entanglement. And essentially is, are you able to merely observe the thoughts that you have? So this is kind of like the awareness of meditation. Are you
Hmm.
able to merely observe the thoughts that you have? Or do you latch on and become entangled and
Hmm.
get caught up in the story, the loop, or whatever narrative that you're creating? And
Hmm.
like, it's okay, you're human, it's going to happen. But the game becomes how quickly can you catch that thought, that entanglement, and
Hmm.
come back to a place of neutrality.
Hmm.
And so it's this combination. And then from that place, like, what did you learn in that moment? And how can you create more useful knowledge
Hmm.
so that the next action that you take is in alignment with your commitments towards the ultimate goal and values that you've set out for yourself?
Hmm.
And so
Beautiful.
it's this interplay between awareness and action. And
Hmm.
the action comes from creating knowledge. And when you can do this, then essentially, I mean, you could take it out to the extremes, but anything that could happen will happen. Like
Hmm.
there's nothing that's impossible that won't happen.
Hmm.
So it's like when you kind of get that, nothing can phase you, and
Hmm.
that's just practice. Now
Hmm.
I'm not at that point, right? Like things still throw me off, and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I thought that I'd be able to regulate myself or not have
Hmm.
that impact me, and it did. Cool. Well, why is that? And I start to unpack that for myself.
And that's
So
that
it's this
reflective.
game of awareness and action. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's that reflective growth. Again, that curiosity of like, oh, that's interesting. I thought I would have been okay with that. I'm not. What can I
Yep.
learn through that, and how can I reflect on that and wait until the next time it comes up, right? It's that same curiosity
Yep.
that you've shared.
Yeah, it is. And one
Hmm.
more thing I'll add to that is sometimes it's not even the why. Like the why doesn't really matter. What's more
Hmm.
important is like, how am I doing that pattern? Because if
Hmm.
sometimes what you need is a pattern interrupt to do something different
Yes.
because we become conditioned to just follow with the patterns and loops that we're in. So
Hmm.
even if I catch myself in a thought, or if a client, if we're working through with a client, I catch himself in a thought, it's like what led them to that thought, not really like the why behind it, because we're going to think regardless, but that thought in particular, can we catch that pattern, create an interrupt to have them think something different? And that
Hmm.
becomes the useful knowledge.
Very, very interesting. Very valuable. Um, Another very big distinction that you've given me a light bulb on today. So thank you for that, Taylor. They're really great.
Yeah.
kind of a practical thing is, do you have a limit? I'm curious for athletes that you work with or gamers or anyone to the time, because I know it's not always time based, but when it comes to practice, like practice is a common thread in all of these different, any kind of skill building and any kind of growth, right? And building the skill of sleep versus NFL versus piano. Um, is there a time limit where you think you really your optimal performance starts to decrease? Like we'll often say you shouldn't practice more than 4 hours a day. Some people practice 8 hours a day and they say they need that much, right? Or does it also depend on the person?
Yeah, my answer is always going to be it depends.
It
I
depends.
think, and
Got it.
again,
Yeah.
for clarity, I don't really
Mhm.
work with a lot of athletes and gamers anymore. Primarily, I'm working with like these business athletes, which is
Mhm.
the CEOs and executives. And even still, like back then, I think what's interesting about like when I reflect back on my time in traditional sports, specifically the NFL,
Mhm.
the people who were in it longer, the guys who've been around for a long time, they actually auto-regulated themselves in practice. And
Mm.
what was interesting is like coaches would be like, "Oh, he's sandbagging," and I'm like, "No, actually, what he's doing is he's regulating himself because he knows that he needs to flip the switch come game day."
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
it's this balance again, coming back to awareness of like knowing
Mhm.
how much to push and when. And I think when gaming, what we noticed we did because we had a ton of data and research on this is looking at when people would play our game, what was the drop off point in performance, and it would kind of vary, but typically depending on how many repetitions, these were 1 minute, very fast paced games. Typically after 30 minutes of
Mhm.
playing nonstop, their performance would dip just a little bit. So it's like,
Mhm.
okay, if we were to give them a little bit of a break and then get them back into it, could they keep that going for longer?
Mm.
And so again, it comes back to just knowing who you are and how you operate and really being honest with there is a point of diminishing return. So what is that point for
Yes.
you?
Brilliant. And I think again that rest and recovery, but then knowing how to make it sustainable. Right? It's like it's not just
Yes.
about putting it all out. You get those 8 hours in a day. You might be able to do that, but after 2 months, you're probably going to be pretty fried.
Yeah.
You'll be toast.
Yes.
Yeah. When we spoke earlier and previously it said like self-awareness is the key to performance. And I really think that you've given a lot of context to that. Really great insight. Do you experience either athletes, gamers, CEOs who experience a fair bit of performance anxiety? And if so, is that addressed mainly through that self-awareness and that exploration of where it's coming from, what the root of it is? Or do you have I'm sure it won't be a clear one size fits all path, but
Yeah.
your insight on
Yes.
that?
Yeah, totally. So
Mm.
I think there's a couple ways to approach it. Um, I'll use an example of an individual that I was working with who very successful VP in the fashion industry, worked at
Mhm.
some amazing outdoor companies, and
Mhm.
then went through a series of layoffs. And in that, he, developed some anxiety about like what's going to come next for me,
Mm.
and ended up having a job interview, a series of interviews, and ended up getting another job. But part of that was like this performance anxiety of going into the interview. And so for him,
Mhm.
it's understanding the root of this anxiety is one
Mhm.
thing. But then also noticing what he would do is always jump to the negative outcome. So for some
Mm.
individuals, a easy shift is saying, okay, well, what is a positive outcome? Like, what is the desired state you actually want to have happen? And if you were
Mhm.
to create that and visualize that and see what you see, hear what you hear, and feel what you feel in that
Mhm.
moment of a successful outcome, what
Yes.
are all the things there that would not have anxiety even show up? And I think it's
Mm.
just talking somebody through that is very helpful. Another way is
Mhm.
like your fear setting exercise is like, what's the worst thing that could happen?
Mm.
That's kind of the
Yeah.
opposite.
Yeah.
Another is, sometimes anxiety or performing under pressure comes from just a lack of preparation. And so
Hmm.
if you really prepare and you're confident in your abilities and also trust the process, that tends to
Hmm.
help too.
Yes.
And I'm giving you a couple of different answers because
Yeah,
everybody's a little bit different in this
that's
situation.
great.
And then another one is, these are hacks for sure, but what are the ways in which you can down or up regulate? Because
Hmm.
sometimes anxiety can have a down regulate, like you're very flat or very low, you need to kind of amp yourself up, or you can be
Hmm.
overstimulated.
Hmm.
And so there's kind of like this framework that kind of ties on the senses where it's like 5 performance tips in under 5 minutes. And my buddy David Nam came up with this framework and kind of riffed on it.
Hmm.
Where the first one is, take 5 minutes and just breathe.
Mm,
And you can do box breathing. So
hmm
4 seconds in, 4 second hold, 4 second exhale, 4 second pause.
hmm
And that rhythmic breathing, again, rhythm, right? Music,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's causing your body to just down regulate.
hmm
On the flip side, if you need to upregulate, you could do a double inhale. Oh, sorry, that's still a down regulation. It's double inhale, slow exhale. It's very fast in the
hmm
moment. So it's a
And
and
that's to
anytime
down
you
regulate.
exhale, that's the down regulate.
hmm
Anytime you do that and exhale longer than an inhale, it's going to cause the parasympathetic to kick on, your diaphragm, slow things down. And
hmm
you could flip that by just breathing, like kind of like Wim Hof breathing, where it's a very fast, they call it breath of fire in yoga, where
hmm
it's continual breathing. That'll ramp yourself up.
hmm
Another tool is listening to music
hmm
and understanding what are the playlists that get you amped up or calm you down, and
Yes.
understanding what your sweet spot is for that. Another one is visualization. So
Hmm
visualizing a successful outcome or visualizing you stepping into that arena or you stepping on stage and you going through your whole routine and what happens before, during, and after. And what's interesting about visualization is people tend to just call on one of the senses.
hmm
There's really like there's seven, right? So you have your eyesight, so eyes, hearing, touch, smell, taste, but
hmm
you also have motion, like are you
hmm
moving through space? And you also
hmm
have emotion. And so
hmm
you have seven things to play with your visualization. So you really want to get at least three of those in motion, like playing together. So whether it's
hmm
like you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're feeling, and then are you moving in space, right? Like
hmm
what does it feel like? And
Interesting.
then the other one is it might be different for musicians because your hands are actually doing something, but
hmm
it's like a kinesthetic or grounding touch, right? So like
hmm
trying to feel the ridges of your fingertips or like pressing your toes into the ground. Because
hmm
sometimes when you're overregulated, all you need is just like ground yourself and be where your feet are at.
hmm Be
And
where
like
your feet
sense yourself getting overregulated and just kind of ground yourself by squeezing your toes, like, oh yeah, I'm right here.
are.
So those are
Hmm.
examples.
Those are brilliant examples. And I love that there's a wide variety between how we can shift what's happening in our minds to what's happening
Yes.
physiologically in our bodies, right? And again, I imagine coming at it from a place of curiosity and testing out which ones you need at different times.
Yes.
And that always
That's
grows
it.
in your self-awareness because you can respond to what you need. Beautiful. Um, so I know that we are in performance-based fields, right? So it's kind of very right front and center that, growing your skills, being ready for that optimal performance is kind of top of mind. For those who aren't in performance fields, I believe ultimately we all have this innate drive to reach our full potential. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're all reaching towards that self-actualization. But if it might not be so clear, how can people start to reach towards their full potential in any field? If there's one piece of advice that you could give them of how they can get started or move forward on that path, what would it be?
Hmm. Ooh, that's a good one.
That's a big one, yeah.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I would say for whatever area of life that they want to get some traction or movement in,
Mhm.
get very clear on what your values are.
Mm,
What is it you value in that area? And it's actually more than just writing your values down on a piece of paper. And it's definitely more than just like picking some words from like some of those value programs that you have online or whatever.
mhm,
And what I mean by that is go through that conversation with somebody else and have them ask you. So I'll play this game with you if you're open to it.
mhm.
Cool. So, what area would you like to elicit some values on?
Um, I guess health,
Health. Okay.
physical health, yes.
So, okay, awesome. So, physical health. So, what's most important to you about physical health?
Honoring the vessel that I've been gifted to move through this world.
Cool.
Mhm.
Awesome. What else?
Impacting others through my example,
Okay.
demonstrating the way that I honor myself so that it will impact my children and those
Cool.
around
What
me.
else? And what else do you
Um,
value in the area of physical health?
longevity,
Cool.
enjoying my time here, truly, and wanting to stay here as long as I can. Yeah.
Yeah. What else?
Yes. Sleep, rest and recovery. That came up lots
Very
today,
cool.
and my friends will tell you I'm obsessed with my Aura Ring tracker and getting high scores on that.
Yeah.
So sleep, rest, and
Cool.
recovery again. Yeah.
And what does sleep, rest, and recovery allow you to do? in the area of physical health?
Rejuvenate, come back as my best self, input
Cool.
more in the ways that I want to
Cool.
have impact. Yeah.
Awesome. Love it.
Mhm.
So, your body is a vessel, the impact, longevity, I heard impact quite a bit.
Mhm.
So you see, like even just having somebody ask you, it's very
Mhm.
different than you just picking from a list of cards
Mhm.
or, selecting from a computer program. And the reason why I
Absolutely.
say that's important is because consciously, it's very easy for us to come up with something, but subconsciously, if you were to really dig and ask questions and tease it out, there's so much more there.
Mhm.
And when you can really elicit a true set of values, values will drive your beliefs about your model of the world and what you choose to filter in terms of your deletion, generalizations, and how you're processing information, and then it informs your behaviors.
Mhm.
So if you get a clean set of values or a clear set of values, it'll help give you a roadmap for what actions you can take,
Mhm.
and at least gives you some direction to take one step.
And then get on that step and then get the feedback and see where it takes you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, so
Really.
it all comes back to values.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Taylor, what is music to you?
I was thinking about this. The first thing that came up when I was thinking was like music is life, right?
Hmm.
It is this
Beautiful.
universal language that connects us
Mhm.
all, and it's all around us. If you think about like the universe, one verse song, it's like one song. And
Mhm.
so it connects us all together. And that's
Mhm.
a very beautiful thing. And it's
Mhm.
this super adaptable, flexible language that allows us
Yeah.
to articulate how we're feeling, even if we can't even put words to it.
Mm, beautifully said. Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Taylor. This has been an absolute gift. All of your insights, all of your perspectives, the way that you are moving through the world and living through your example of all the ways that you impact different fields. Thank you for sharing that with us today. How can our listeners find you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, well, first, thanks so much for having me on. This has been a
My
pleasure and,
pleasure.
and amazing sharing space with you. Uh, TaylorJohnson.com, or sorry, TaylorJohnsonPerformance.com is
Great.
my website. And then follow me on LinkedIn. That's where I do all my posting.
Beautiful. And we'll make sure the links to that are in the notes to this show. And thank you
Great.
again. Thank you for joining us on the Music Mindset Podcast. We look forward to learning more about what you are going to be bringing into the world.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Taylor.